As they had throughout their initial attacks elsewhere, the Japanese attacked the airfields in an attempt to secure air superiority for their invading forces. These initial strikes were devastating to the newly arrived units that were not fully ready for combat.
A lot of our airplanes were damaged or totally destroyed, and hangars were on fire.
We took off a beating there because they weren't equipped for it.
The Japanese intelligence on American defenses was excellent. Once the airfields had been attacked, other installations became targets for the marauding Japanese planes.
There were so many flights of Japanese airplanes and stuff going over there that the air warning wasn't worth any good at all, because there'd be a flight of them here and a flight of them there all over the Philippines. And all day there, the Japanese airplanes were knocking everything out.
We was getting an air raid, you know, a couple of times a day. Well, the alarms would go, you know, and we'd back out, just back out and set it on the bottom, you know, to cover the boat until the air raid was over, and then we'd surface and come back in.
The fury of these strikes woke the Americans and Filipinos from their stupor, and they attempted to strike back, crippled as they were.
The American fighters in the Philippines were overwhelmed almost immediately because the pilots themselves did not have the experience to compete with the Japanese, who were all combat veterans. Many of the American pilots had never even fired their guns, and some had just gotten into P-40s and P-35s and were fresh out of training command back in the States. The other issue was the fact that the aircraft themselves had a low serviceability rate because there was no great logistical support for the fighter units in the Philippines. There just weren't the parts available to keep the birds in the air.
The Japanese Zero was the airplane that the fighter had. Very, very good airplane. It would turn very fast and go very fast. We had trouble with them. They had us beaten.
Most of the ships of the hopelessly outnumbered American Asiatic fleet had withdrawn out of the range of Japanese planes.
We left Manila, I believe it was November 25th. Everything left Manila except, you know, auxiliaries and submarines, and we were scattered.
While the Navy's scattered deployment largely saved them from the fate suffered by the Far East Air Force, it also meant that they were unable to immediately strike back at the approaching Japanese fleet.
Some historians have argued that the Asiatic fleet's surface component could have done better than it did. The surface fleet never had a chance, and if you look at it, they fought in the Philippines and the Dutch East Indies. And where was the main Japanese effort in the early portion of the war? The Philippines, Malaya, and the Dutch East Indies. So this little tiny appendix of a fleet, an American fleet, was basically facing the entire combined might of the Japanese Imperial Navy and their Naval Air Force. They never had a chance.
The Navy's submarines slipped out of Manila to take the war to the Japanese.
And we ended up in Marvelis Bay. And then we ended up doing patrols up around Lingayen Gulf. And then they laid a bunch of mines out there. And when we come in and out, we had to go through them. And the last time we went out, I'll never forget, we were submerged after we got out past Corregidor. And you could hear them rubbing the cables of the mines bouncing along the side of the ship. But the mines were above us, see. But you really had to know what you was doing to get through those.
War had come like a lightning bolt from the sky. The sudden shock of going from life in a tropical paradise to fighting for their lives against an enemy which had been the object of contempt and was now seemingly unstoppable was too much for some of the Americans.
When we were up there in these patrols, we looked around every once in a while. And here was just like a forest of trees, the whole Japanese fleet coming in. And then the exec called the old man. And he came up, and he looked at it, and he just stood there. He says, take her to 300 feet and rig for depth charge. He could have fired all of his torpedoes and expended them all and got shots, you know, got good shots. But he didn't. Of course, that's when we went back into Manila Bay, and he was relieved by another fellow.
At the same time, the surface ships of the Allied fleets encountered the new realities of war.
From there on, we convoyed a lot of ships that were coming down from the Philippines, from China, wherever they came from. They all went south, of course. And then the Prince of Wales and the Repulse came out there, and 2 days later they were sunk.
And when Prince of Wales and Repulse, the two huge battleships, arrived, we knew that the war was going to be won. However, what we didn't know was the capability of the Japanese Air Force to destroy those ships.
It kind of concerned us, you know, if they can sink a couple of big ones like that, what kind of a chance do we have? Because we were, you might say, at their mercy because what we had didn't amount to much.
In fact, on the day that it was destroyed, or sunk, I was sent out to a position where she was supposed to have been, and I found nothing. I noticed when I was flying out a destroyer coming in with huge numbers of people on board, and I wondered somebody must be evacuated somewhere, and I was there to prove that the ship had been sunk, both the Repulse and the Prince of Wales.
Seriously outgunned, lacking effective air support, and badly in need of maintenance, the ships of the Allies attempted to hold back the Japanese with reckless courage.
Their skipper had gotten the crew together, and he said, men, he says, we're in not the best situation out here. He said, at any time we could encounter a Japanese man of war. He says, if we can outrun her, we will. But if they have us outgunned and can outrun, he said, we'll sail right towards her, make as small a target as we can, we'll sail in beneath her guns, and we'll close and board her.
There were 4 destroyers led by the John D. Ford, and they went in a surprise early morning attack in Balikpapan. Convoy was coming through, landing troops, I guess, and they went in, made this attack, and came out. And we were supposed to fall in behind them, and if they were chased, then we were supposed to be protecting them, but nobody chased them out. I guess they were such a surprise to the Japs.
This successful strike by obsolete destroyers on the transports led to swift and decisive action by the Japanese against the gathering Allied fleet.
I think it was around about 10 o'clock in the morning when they spotted these Japs coming. Went to battle stations, and my battle station was a forward battle repair just before the officer's wardroom. And they made, I don't know how many runs they made on us, and finally they hit us. We took 2 direct hits and 1 near miss. Took 1 hit just after the superstructure, the bridge, and then 1 in the back aft in the steering engine room. We were in a hard left turn, and that damaged the steering engine, and the rudder was jammed. And then we took a near miss, tore a big hole there. That's what almost sunk us, I think. And that's when I became a casualty.
Under nearly constant air attack and engaged by superior Japanese fleet elements, the outgunned Allied vessels suffered horrific damage.
I was supposed to go on the light cruiser, the Trump. And the Trump came in that day, and it was had an encounter with a Japanese battleship. It was badly damaged, but came in and was able to, on his own power, and we had to remove some of the many bodies that were, all these boys were killed. And it really, as an 18-year-old boy, young man, it scared the living daylight out of me for the first time, because And I saw these bodies, that they had to put on the trucks and remove them from the ship.
One by one, the valiant remnants of the Allied fleet were damaged or sunk in battles with the Japanese naval and air forces bearing down on the Dutch East Indies. While the combined Allied fleets had tried valiantly to hold off Japanese invasion forces throughout the Far East, their efforts had been in vain. The Japanese came ashore virtually at will. As early as December of 1941, invasion forces landed at many places in the Philippines.
The government called us and said, you must get the women and children out of there right now. The Japanese have landed 80 miles north of you, and they're headed your way.
General MacArthur had changed the defensive plans to defending forward and denying the Japanese a landing. Unfortunately, the Japanese landed halfway up Lingayen Gulf, not where the Americans had expected, and met little resistance. The American defenses began to come apart.
And when the Battle of the Beachhead failed, the Americans and Filipinos were unable to evacuate effectively back to their original defensive lines around Manila Bay. One of the reasons that starvation and disease took such a toll among the defenders of the Bataan Peninsula and of Corregidor Island is that a lot of the supplies had been moved forward to support the Beachhead battle and were never brought back when the troops retreated.
General Jonathan Skinny Wainwright, the commander of the Northern Luzon Force, conducted a delaying action. The Philippine scouts fought ferociously.
The Philippine scouts were a group of soldiers that were Filipinos that had American officers, and they were there from probably the time the Americans had from the Spanish times, and the father and son and everything. It was a family affair, and all they done was train and infantry, cavalry and stuff like that, and they were very, very good. They were probably some of a group of the finest soldiers in World War II at that early time. And they had a cavalry that when the tanks were going from southern Luzon up and across to get to Bataan, and their cavalry was on horseback, and the Japanese brought tanks in there, and the Filipinos attacked them on horseback. And we ate the horses, that group of scouts from the Philippines, and they're practically wiped out. And but they kept the bridges and stuff open till our tanks got across, and then they had the infantry, the Philippine infantry. Whenever there was a hot spot, that they'd bring them.
American and Filipino forces became increasingly confused. MacArthur ordered his troops to fall back on Bataan.
Somebody gave the order to start marching towards Manila. We then moved down into the Bataan Peninsula. This retreat was being handled very nicely. It looked like it was a well-organized retreat down from Lingayen Gulf down into the Bataan Peninsula. It just seemed like it was mathematically correct. The only thing, nobody brought any food along.
The defense of the Philippines is terribly executed. It was probably impossible to ever defend it to begin with.
The original defensive plan for the Philippines, approved by the War Department, and one which the forces in the Philippines practiced and were prepared to execute, was basically to abandon the Philippines not try to hold everything, but protect the vital spot, which was Manila Bay, because that is the anchorage that the U.S. Navy would eventually need if it was going to come to the rescue.
The hopes of the Philippines and all America now rested on the tired, haggard men who fell back into the Bataan Peninsula. There they grimly awaited the Japanese onslaught. They would not have long to wait. General Homma, the Japanese commander, actually had fewer troops besieging Bataan than the Americans had on the peninsula. However, they were better trained overall and supported by nearly unchallenged air and naval forces.
Bataan was a peninsula. We put a line across that peninsula with we had the 31st Infantry there, and the Air Force didn't have any airplanes, so they made them infantry, and they were up there, but none of those were trained very well for, except the 31st Infantry.
And I was one of the few guys, I had learned to hunt and everything when I was a kid. My dad had showed me. There was about a half a dozen of us that had quite a bit of experience with rifles, and the rest of them hadn't. Here they'd come through the Army, through basic, everything. They'd never fired any kind of a weapon in their life. And they were to go out and shoot against Jap infantry that were experts. We were in sad shape.
We knew nothing about infantry fighting. We were totally inexperienced in infantry fighting. We just, we had rifles issued to us, and we knew how to work them, but we knew nothing about tactics.
We didn't have any training as infantry. We had training climbing poles and stuff like that, and running telephone lines and stuff like that.
General Homa's troops attacked the center of U.S. Filipino positions in mid-January 1942.
We leaned out our windows and watched it at night. We could hear it. We could hear the big guns, of course, and we could see the flashes of light.
Already short of supplies, the inexperienced U.S. and Filipino forces held the Japanese for almost 2 weeks before the position was broken.
When General Homa's Japanese forces began their attack on the main American defensive line on the Bataan Peninsula, they discovered that the going was really tough. The Americans were dug in and fighting hard. After 2 weeks of fighting, the Japanese found a way through by pushing over a mountain that the Americans had failed to defend strongly enough. Then the Americans were forced to fall back to their second line, and here there was no way around. The Japanese had no choice but to make head-on assaults, which were costly and, at least for a while, ineffective.
Both sides were now exhausted, racked with illness and short on food, medicine, and ammunition. However, the Japanese were able to bring in reinforcements and more supplies, while the Americans and Filipinos could only make do with what they could find.
We were on very short rations. Ate up the pack mules and the horses and carabao and everything else was there. There was a bunch of Filipino civilians got down on the peninsula as well, so they had to be fed. But we only ate twice a day, and it didn't amount to much.
And we had to live mainly off of the lunch. The three of us were sitting under a tree waiting for a bunch of chickens to come out where we could get them. And the fellow in the middle got a bullet through his forehead, and the sniper was in a tree right above us. And of course, we didn't get the chicken.
As the situation deteriorated further, General MacArthur was ordered out by the president. Though most of the soldiers understood the reasoning, the bitterness about his departure is still with them.
Nobody had much use for him, really. He was arrogant.
Dugout Doug? I didn't like him at all. He came over to Bataan once, I think, for about 15 minutes, right back out to the corridor, down the tunnel.
It all depends who you're talking with. I don't think he deserved the name Dugout Doug, because if you look over his record in World War I, he did some very courageous things. But he did spend a lot of time in Corregidor, in the tunnels in Corregidor. But I think one thing that bothered people a little bit was the statement that I shall return. Everyone was thinking, well, why couldn't he have used the plural? And then he was so melodramatic that I think it rubbed an awful lot of people the wrong way.
To break the stalemate, the Japanese tried a series of small amphibious landings on the coast of Bataan, which were countered by the defenders.
They would try to attack us, and we would counterattack them, but we didn't know the terrain, and neither did they, and we didn't realize for a little while that there was a sharp gully that went right up through the middle of the point. And they were coming up this gully, and they would attack our headquarters and our rear. And while we were chasing them towards the point, then we'd come back, and they'd go back down the gully, and we wouldn't know what was going on. It was nip and tuck, and it was pretty fierce all the way around.
And we finally drove them over the cliff down on the line. They stayed hid down there in caves along, and we were on top of the bluff. It wasn't a high bluff.
They were all dug in, and they had a cave over the hill where they could go back to, and foxholes and everything, and you just couldn't get them out.
We tried several different approaches, and they didn't work. So my squadron commander, Captain Dyes, he got this idea of putting together a flotilla of boats and mounted 50 calibers on them, and our flotilla opened fire on the caves. They apparently radioed in air support, so our guys came under a dive bomber attack. A few casualties in that, but it did do the job. We eliminated the Japanese in the caves.
But the bad part of the whole thing is we were cleaning out, and we were told not to take any prisoners. So if we saw one we thought was still alive, why, most of them were dead, why, we'd shoot him.
Then on the 3rd of April, General Homa launched a new offensive. After fierce but brief resistance, the line cracked and Bataan was finished.
On Good Friday, they decided that they would launch their attack. And they did. They put everything they had into it, and it didn't work. Our boys in the front line stopped them. And no matter how hard they tried, our guys saw to it that they didn't come through.
The attacks by General Homa's troops against the second line on Bataan proved to be futile at first. It was only after a Japanese captain found a small gap and managed to infiltrate his company through that the line was broken. However, once that line was broken, the Japanese found that there was virtually nothing behind it to hold them up.
And the guys were just flat worn out. Everybody was. But General King, Major General King, realized that that was the end of the line, and so he arranged to surrender our forces on Bataan.
We had the news that night, that evening, and it was all over the camp. It just swirled around through the camp. Bataan is gone.
The American commander had surrendered to prevent a useless slaughter. When the forces on the Bataan Peninsula surrendered, the Japanese were unprepared for the numbers of prisoners that would confront them.
Following the American surrender on Bataan, the Japanese are amazed to discover they have 3 times more American prisoners than they ever imagined that they would have. And so they lack medical facilities, they lack food, they lack transportation for all these prisoners. And that, coupled with the brutality of the Japanese guards and a desire for revenge, all these factors together create the situation that becomes known as the Bataan Death March.
When Bataan surrendered, they thought the war was practically over. But they were very upset with us, and we were the lowest possible thing that a human being could be because we had been surrendered.
That evening,
The bunch that I was in, we left and marched most all night, except for a few rest periods. There was about 200 of us in the bunch.
Nobody knew where we were going or why or anything. But a couple of days later, I got to San Fernando. I just barely made it, and I was, how you get to where you're about ready to faint and everything, and I hadn't. I'd stole one egg on the way since that can of tomatoes, and that was about 11 days it took me to make that trip when I got to San Fernando. And in one place, they fed us on that, a bowl of rice. So I had an egg and a can of tomatoes and a bowl of, and a rice ball in that 11 days. And Corregidor had refused to surrender at that time. They were still fighting out on Corregidor.
Across a narrow strait, the defenders of Corregidor watched and waited for the Japanese onslaught. It came in the form of shelling and air raids. For over a month, the tiny island was subjected to a terrific bombardment.
The last days of the Battle of Corregidor, we had lost our water and our electricity, and we were nearly out of all kinds of ammunition and food. And they said, well, they're going to invade us. The enemy's going to land now, so you guys that can, get down there on the beach.
The Japs were landing on Corregidor barges, and there was one of our 4 anti-aircraft guns that could shoot at them with, and they shot it until the breech block jammed from the heat.
They let down the front gates on their barges, and the enemy started coming ashore with their shouts and yells. And we who were there started firing back the best we could, and I was in between 2 dead Marines. And so I shot up all of my rifle ammunition plus all of my pistol ammunition and threw my hand grenades, and they were still coming. And as a light would go up every once in a while, we could see that they were all around us. And then I couldn't decide what to do. I thought, well, how do I continue the fight? I don't have anything to fight with.
We got credit for a lot of Japs that morning. They ran up the white flag at noon on Corregidor and Fort Hughes both, all the other islands too in the bay, and they made us all stand up and put our hands behind our heads or up in the air, and they went around collecting wristwatches and rings and whatever else they wanted.
And that was a very sad time to have that flag come down. I'll never forget that.
After the devastating Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, island after island had fallen to the imperial war machine. Only in the Philippines had resistance to the Japanese invasion lasted more than a couple of months. It was there, in the Philippines, that the gallant defenders of Bataan and Corregidor grimly fought and died to buy time for America. Even as time ran out on the starved and ragged defenders, the United States began to answer Japan's challenge.
Japanese have a very low opinion at the beginning of the war of the American fighting man's capabilities. Partly this is a racial attitude on the part of the Japanese, and part of it is a belief that has been instilled from Western culture as it is viewed from Japan, that we're soft, that life has been too easy, that we don't have the resolve, and that most Americans won't fight to the death, as every Japanese soldier is trained to do from the very first day, actually long before he comes into the military. That is the expectation. The problem for the Japanese is that attitude is reinforced somewhat early in the war. The victories that the Japanese win in the Philippines and in a few other places where they fight Westerners, such as in Malaya, it's almost too easy for the Japanese. And their pre-war stereotypes of the soft Westerner who is not committed and who won't fight to the death tend to be reinforced in those early campaigns. The Japanese were wrong. They misjudged the American willpower, they misjudged American resolve, they misjudged the willingness and the ability of the American soldier.
As Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto had feared when he expressed his reservations before the war, Japan had awakened a sleeping giant, one that was just beginning to flex its muscles. The news of the attacks on
December 7th, and I happened to be in camp at that time because I was in charge of quarters. So it was a big rush to depart from Fort Lewis to our defense positions in the Pacific Northwest, where we had already set up gun positions.
I was in the bathroom shaving when suddenly the radio in the house was turned up to blasting, and came the words, blow-by-blow description of them attacking Pearl Harbor, that the Philippines was under attack. And so all of this, and it wasn't very long until we were called out to the base.
I know it was about 10 o'clock, 10:30 in the morning, and all of a sudden over the radio, here come the news that they were bombing Pearl Harbor. And boy, I tell you, all hell broke loose. First, we couldn't believe it. But I'll tell you, by the next morning and the morning after, they had sandbags.
Gathered all of us in uniform, told us get back to the base, emergency recall. Went back to the base, we went to a wartime footing, and it's amazing. You go wartime footing when you're in a training command. We couldn't make love, let alone make war, young cadet. The next day I'm flying an SB C-4 dive bomber with depth charges over the Gulf of Mexico looking for Japanese submarines. I wouldn't have known what to do with one if I found it.
In early 1942, few in America knew what Japanese...
They always are. The Japanese were about to invade the West Coast. And we were all just sure we'd get up the next morning and...
Our sirens, and if you were in the store and your kids were home, well, you were pretty panicky. Let's get home, because you didn't know what was going to happen.
It was almost like they're afraid the Japs were going to become steaming up the San Antonio River. Had evacuation plans to evacuate all the aircraft and disperse them. It was kind of hectic.
United States artillerymen roll out ammunition for the huge disappearing guns that are a part of America's elaborate coastal defense system.
Waiting for the expected invasion quickly turned into a routine of patrols with the few soldiers and limited equipment available. The coastline was long, sparsely populated, and vulnerable to any invading force.
The entire coast from Canada to Mexico was outposted by units from the Presidio of San Francisco and from Fort Ord and from down San Diego and up at Fort Lewis and so forth.
And our battalion had the mission of protecting the coast from the Canadian line down as far as Everett, Washington. And of course, had there been a landing in any force, we couldn't have held much. You can imagine a battalion defending that 100 miles or so of coastline.
We had observer patrols, and that is, we set out in different places around along the coast, and even inland about as much as 50 or 100 miles, in a civilian observer corps. And there was a bunch of volunteers, and they were just sitting, they logged every airplane that come over. They didn't know, and they called them in. They didn't know exactly what they were.
No invasion came. None was planned. Despite the audacious attack on Pearl Harbor, Imperial Japan lacked the resources While those available units did what could be done to secure the West Coast, America as a nation went to work to provide the equipment and supplies that would be needed to take the war to the enemy in what had become a global conflict. It would take machinery.
The war was on and everybody was in war production work of some kind, shipyards or whatever.
We had no choice but to, in effect, take over all of the production facilities that could be turned to war uses. Marvelous things began to happen. They were turning out Liberty ships in 2 or 3 days, I think, before it was all cut and dried. Airplanes, we were the provider for the world.
Yamamoto, had pretty good knowledge of the United States, said, I've got about 6 months, with the pre-war Navy and our preparation and our preparedness level. For 6 months, I can do pretty much anything we want. And after that, we're in trouble, because then the industrial capacity, the long-range strength starts coming into play, and you cannot match it. You look at the relative industrial capacities, Japan is the weakest of the so-called great powers in 1940-41.
As America poured her resources into the war machine, rationing of basic civilian...
Night, the gas was limited, restricted, rationed to 3 gallons a week, and you could only drive 35 miles an hour all over the country. And this was not state police enforcing it. These would be Army and Navy troops.
There was food rationing for different types of food. And then all the people that lived in a residence were requested to dig up their backyard and make a victory garden.
It was based mostly on how many children you had, and and then you were allowed so many coupons for shoes and so many for sugar, and those are the main things that people really were interested in.
It wasn't simply a matter of more production. The period between the Great Wars witnessed a serious decline in the training and capability of America's fighting forces. They simply were not ready to go to battle in 1941. Much work lay ahead to provide the armed forces with modern equipment and soldiers trained to use it.
Through 1941, most of our Army troops were using broomsticks for training purposes for guns, and fake tanks with cardboard sides. We'd practice shooting at them, and they'd use logs for artillery pieces, and that was the kind of training that we had. We were completely inept.
We dumped everything from World War I, and we brought it up to date. We just came alive into a brand new military existence within 2 or 3 years. And so in 1940, when we started mobilizing for war, we were well on our way with good equipment.
Soon, large numbers of war machines and the soldiers trained to use them were ready to go overseas. However, with its battleships at the bottom of Pearl Harbor, the U.S. Navy lacked the strength to protect the transport of troops and supplies gathering in the harbors of the West Coast from the Japanese fleet and Air Force. Unable to challenge the Japanese fleet with conventional naval power, America turned to new ways to take the fight to the enemy.
We were without battleships and some cruisers, and our fleet was very badly decimated. Consequently, there was no other arms to send out to hold the enemy back or get back at the enemy other than the submarines. The submarines played a major role in holding back the enemy till we built our fleet up.
It was lonely and dangerous for the early submarine crews as they stalked the Japanese fleet beneath the waters of the Far East. These were the forerunners of a fleet of over 50 such boats that would help to destroy Japanese merchant shipping by the end of the war.
Submarines are a silent service. They can be completely submerged and go into areas where no surface ship can go.
We were assigned a certain area in the ocean as our area, and we were told that the only ships that would be in that area would be enemy ships. we would receive messages from the base, from Pearl Harbor, and from places down in the Australian area, telling us about messages that they had intercepted of the Japanese and where they figured convoys and individual ships were passing and that sort of thing, which our skipper that would then use as an indication where we should go and look for enemy ships.
In this deadly game, the hunter could become the hunted at any moment.
Almost invariably after you fired torpedoes, the escorts could see the torpedo tracks, and they knew where the torpedoes came from, and they'd just run down the torpedo track expecting to find a submarine at the other end, and they usually would.
We get over 100 depth charges before we even fired a torpedo. You hear this big crack, boy, and the old boat goes like this, and you don't know whether it's down underneath you or on top of you.
We took some terrible depth charging. The Japs controlled the air, and the Japs had plenty of depth charges. We used various and sundry methods of evading them if possible, and I'm living proof that we've evaded right many.
There were 3 destroyers caught us. They started dropping charges, and I couldn't count them. And they beat the hell out of us down there. Knocked our lockers open, clothes all over, knocked the lights out, and had to go to battle lanterns, but no damage. So that was just lucky.
In the early days, the war waged by American submariners was hindered by flawed torpedo technology.
The U.S. Navy's main problem was simply reliability.
We fired 19 torpedoes, and we could hear them hitting the hull, and we were being fired on from the direction the torpedoes were coming from. But we never got any damage done, or no hits. None of them exploded.
It was frustration of the first order. You never saw such a dejected bunch in your life as you did when 4 torpedoes were fired and the sound man heard 2 of them hit and none go off.
Along with the submarines, PT boats played a vital role in the early days of the war. It was tough, dirty fighting, with the Japanese holding many advantages in the far-flung islands. Around 80 feet long, capable of 40 knots, and packed with guns, the patrol torpedo, or PT boats, were small, fast, and deadly.
We needed something that could be built fast and built in a hurry in order to fight the Japs.
Their main job was to harass the Japanese Navy, and especially to harass the logistics. It wasn't so much that they were going to attack a battleship or a destroyer, but that they could go after transports and anything trying to support the Navy, and especially in the Solomons, where you had lots of anchorages, lots of protected water. PD boats are not an open ocean weapon. They haven't got the range.
Operating at night among the islands of the Pacific, these small maneuverable craft struck at Japanese shipping and troop transport.
We left in the daylight, last of the daylight pretty much. We got on patrol probably in about 2 hours. We were patrolling against barges.
I think the boats as a whole did an excellent job in the Solomons and New Guinea in combating the barge traffic.
The difficulty of their mission, the constant strain of night fighting, and the cramped quarters of the small boats created an unbreakable camaraderie among the PT boat crew members.
You depended upon each other in such a tremendous way. We tend to feel that PT boaters were a chosen people on a special boat, on a special mission that'll never be repeated.
You know that you don't fight for your country, you fight for your buddies. Get them out of there. And you're responsible, every one of us, when we're in combat, has a responsibility to do a job. And we don't let our buddies down.
The submarines and PT boats were not alone when carrying the war to the Japanese. The U.S. Navy's carriers had also survived the debacle at Pearl Harbor.
The series of hit-and-run carrier raids, primarily throughout the Central and South Pacific, beginning in the Gilberts and Marshalls, starting in February of 1942, the Leh-Salamaua raid, which preceded the Battle of the Coral Sea, and then, of course, the Doolittle raid against Japan proper that was launched from the Hornet in April of 1942.
I very well can remember the first day of the first attack we went under. I was up on a signal bridge. The radar picked up these planes coming in, and pretty soon here they were. I looked up and there were 10 of them, just as big as life and twice as ugly, you know. And old Captain Browning yelled out, he said, "When in the hell are you going to start shooting?" And about that time, every gun on the ship went off. We had what we call a combat air patrol up over the ship. We had about 4 fighters up there, F-4Fs when we were flying then, the Grumman's. They took off up after them, and they were up so high, so they went clear up high to find them. And next thing you know, those Japs had turned and come back, and they were real low this time. And all of a sudden, here comes all these eggs down, you know. And the first man that was killed on the ship was a boatswain's mate. Blew his leg off, a piece of shrapnel when that bomb went off. That was the first casualty we had on the ship. But anyhow, then that was our first baptism to fire. So,
despite the carrier raids, the destruction of the Allied Far Eastern Fleet and the failed defense of the Dutch East Indies created an opportunity for the Japanese to carry out carrier raids of their own.
In April of 1942, the Japanese took 5 of their fleet carriers and 1 other aircraft carrier into the Indian Ocean to raid the British naval base at Ceylon and try to destroy the British Indian Ocean Fleet, which composed 3 aircraft carriers and 5 battleships. Well, the net result was the Japanese were very successful. They sank the aircraft carrier Hermes and a cruiser, and then the Japanese carrier Ryujo raided along the coast of India and Burma and destroyed all the British coastal traffic there. And that actually took years for the British to recover from that particular disaster. So as far as the major significance of the Indian Ocean raids go, it was the Ryujo, this little aircraft carrier, that did the bulk of the damage.
The Japanese fleet struck at the surviving Allied ships gathering at the port of Darwin in northern Australia. Long-ranged PBY Catalinas took to the air patrolling for the Japanese fleet. However, these lumbering flying boats were no match for the nimble Japanese fighters.
Usually you're dodging in and out of clouds as much as you can because you sure don't want a zero on your tail. I got shot at a few times, and it's not a great deal of fun.
In a repeat of the Pearl Harbor raid, the Japanese struck the port of Darwin by surprise. Although the Allied ships reacted quickly and fought back, the Japanese sank or disabled the majority of the ships in the harbor.
I remember plain as day sitting up on the forecastle talking with the crew and hearing this buzzing sound, looking up, and the sky is black with bombers coming in. We took a bomb hit aft, and figure was a 100-pounder, and that put our steering out of commission. So the only thing you do was back up and go forward.
but there was 22 ships went into there, 11 in each task force that went into Tokyo on that Tokyo raid. Of course, we left them all behind because the weather was so bad. When we took off to go at, was only 3 cruisers and the Hornet and the Enterprise took off to make the final run onto Tokyo.
As the American carriers made their final run to the launch point, they actually ran across a small Japanese picket boat. They sank it, but it took some time to do it, and the American commanders on the scene decided that they must have gotten off a radio report, and thus the element of surprise for the raid had been lost. Well, that led directly to the decision to launch the B-25s early from several hundred miles away from the original launch point.
Colonel Doolittle and his volunteers flying those B-25s off the carrier, dropping the bombs on the Japanese home island, really cause insignificant damage in a military sense, but give America at home a much-needed morale boost and show that the Japanese are not invincible, even though most of the aircraft and many of the aircrew were lost in the process.
Guys at the sharp end, those who were going head-to-head with the Japanese, some degree of confidence that they could do the job. All they needed was the opportunity, and those opportunities did come in May at the Coral Sea and certainly at Midway in June.
Having run unchecked throughout the first months of the war, the Japanese had rapidly achieved their limited war goals. Unwilling to stop and give the Allies a chance to recover, the Japanese High Command sought the opportunity to expand on their remarkable success and threaten Australia. With that goal in mind, in the beginning of May 1942, the Japanese began operations designed to secure the Solomon Islands and all of New Guinea, including the Allied base at Port Moresby. Having broken the Japanese code, the Allies massed what power they could in the threatened sector to try to hold off the Japanese.
In the Battle of the Coral Sea, the Japanese were coming down to take over the southern New Guinea and Australia. And we didn't have too many forces out there, as you know, at that time.
Strategically, the Japanese objective was to land an amphibious invasion force at Port Moresby, New Guinea, which, had it succeeded, would have put them in a position to build up a major offensive against northern Australia.
They'd intercept all these Jap messages. Like, for instance, they'd get a message where the Jap commander would order an attack on Port Moresby, for instance, you know, at 8 o'clock in the morning. Well, 8 o'clock in the morning, they'd be waiting for them.
Coral Sea was a two-day carrier phase following some American strikes against Japanese naval air bases in the area. This was the first time in history that aircraft carriers had actually fought each other. If ever there had been any doubt, especially on the American side, that the war in the Pacific was going to hinge upon aircraft carriers, Coral Sea would have removed any doubt about that. For the first time in naval history, the opposing fleets never even sighted one another. So Coral Sea is where carrier combat really began.
Now, there wasn't a clear-cut winner in the Battle of Coral Sea, but at least they were stopped for the first time.
Their invasion force is turned back, and they are unable to make an assault landing in the area of Port Moresby and take it out that way. So they will ultimately attempt to attack Port Moresby overland, over the Stanley Mountains, and that will fail. Tactically, it's pretty much a draw or a Japanese victory, because the Japanese are able to sink one American carrier and heavily damage the other one. For their part, the Americans sink a light Japanese carrier, damage one of the Japanese fleet carriers, and also inflict heavy damage on the carrier air groups for the Japanese. And so the bottom line tactically is both of the fleet carriers of the Japanese that are involved in Coral Sea are out of action for the Battle of Midway, which is coming up. In these early months of the war, the Japanese have enjoyed an unbroken string of success. They've really run amok throughout the entire Pacific, and they seem unbeatable. But now, riding on the back of the American carrier fleet, things are beginning to turn around for the United States in the Pacific.
Coral Sea had been a tactical victory for the Japanese, but also a strategic defeat. This, coupled with the stinging Doolittle raid on the home islands of Japan, caused the Japanese Imperial War Staff to seek to draw the remaining elements of the American Pacific Fleet into a decisive battle for control of the Pacific. The Japanese felt that an attack on Midway, threatening Hawaii itself, would force America into a sea battle they neither wanted nor were prepared to fight.
Midway, therefore, was pretty much a roll of the geopolitical dice. They knew that eventually American industrial capacity would overwhelm Japan's. But if the United States Pacific Fleet and its Army counterparts were forced to withdraw from Hawaii with a Japanese buildup only 1,100 miles from Pearl Harbor, That would allow Japan the critical breathing space she needed to digest the enormous ocean and land areas along the Pacific Rim that they had accumulated in the previous 6 months.
Unknown to the Japanese, the Americans had once again broken Japan's naval code and had deduced the target of their impending attack. This had triggered Admiral Nimitz, the commander of the U.S. Pacific Fleet, to order a rapid U.S. reinforcement of Midway.
Nimitz and his crew came out and inspected all of Midway. And we sort of said, well, why? Well, of course, nobody said anything. The big wheels wouldn't say anything. And I think that the colonel and on up, they knew what was going on.
I deduce, nobody told me, but I deduce that Joe Rochefort, the codebreaker, had found out that the Japs were going to hit somewhere, but he hadn't decided yet where they were going to hit. All of a sudden, they made us pack up all the ammo and bombs and everything we could and flew right out to Midway.
Located 1,100 miles west of Hawaii, Midway had been transformed since the war began from a Pan American clipper stop into a forward base.
There's 2 islands. One's called Eastern Island. That was the Pan American base, and they turned it into a submarine base. The other island is just a little flat island, and they had built concrete runways.
We had scores of aircraft based ashore on Midway itself.
The whole bomber squadron, VMSB 231 at that time, was housed on the southern side of the island, and we lived in a dugout.
They had 27 dive bombers, 17 B-17s, and I think about 27 PBYs on one field, and a couple of gas trucks.
The small American garrison did what it could to prepare, and every available plane began to scout for the expected Japanese thrust.
We started flying every day, which is not normal. A patrol flight takes like 14, 15 hours, and you don't want to do that every day, especially when you come back to the base. And there at Midway, they didn't have much in the way of fueling facilities. So you come back from a 15-hour patrol, and somebody's got to put the gas in the tanks. So the enlisted guys take turns waiting with the airplane. Now you get back in after dark, you know, and so maybe you get fueled up by midnight, and the normal operating procedure is to start and check the engines at 3 o'clock in the morning, and then shut them down, have breakfast, and then eventually, as it becomes daylight, why the officers show up, and then we all take off on patrol. Okay, you're taking off on patrol at 5 o'clock in the morning, and you're gone for 15 hours, and then you spend a couple hours at least waiting for the gas truck and an hour filling the tanks. You got 1,800 gallons to put in this silly airplane, you know. It was every day. The flight surgeons were requiring us to swallow amphetamines to keep on our toes.
The fighter squadron, 211, shot down 2 Japanese patrol planes while I was out there, out in the northwest section, and that was their only action. We didn't see much action. Once in a while we'd be out there and get told to look for a submarine, but they sank one. I wasn't in on that, but they did sink one. Every Friday night we'd get shelled by the submarines. That was quite an occasion because it was our only diversion, because they never hit anything. You can imagine these Japanese subs were out there watching us as we were looking for them.
As the Japanese confidently steamed toward Midway, Admiral Nimitz prepared to ambush them with his 3 remaining carriers.
When Admiral Nimitz learned through his codebreakers that a major Japanese force was bound for Midway in early June of 1942, the only option he had was to commit the remaining American carriers to the battle. Both navies had been planning and discussing and practicing for essentially the same event for almost 20 years. But the fly in the ointment was that, at least from the Japanese perspective, was that it was of necessity going to be a carrier battle, 3 American carriers against 4 Japanese. Had that battle succeeded, and from the Japanese perspective, had they been able to land their 5,000-man Naval Special Landing Force unit and occupy Midway, it would have placed all of the rest of the Hawaiian Islands within range of Japanese land-based air power.
The dynamic of the war in the Pacific was about to dramatically shift in the waters near a tiny atoll only 6 miles wide. The defenders of Midway waited for the Japanese they knew were coming.
The Midway-based PBYs actually kicked off the battle. Shortly after dawn on June 4th, they located not only what they thought was the main body of the Japanese force, but the invasion transports as well. So that forced Admiral Nagumo to knock Midway out of the battle as soon as possible in order to deal with any American fleet units that might turn up in the area.
They sent out the B-17s, and they bombed them first from 20,000 feet and then from 8,000 feet. And of course, you don't hit a ship, not from 8,000 feet, no way. They just threw the bombs away. But our executive officer took 4 PBYs that they brought in specially from Pearl Harbor. They put torpedo under the right wing on each one of them. And he went out that night and he torpedoed a ship in the invasion fleet.
Didn't sink it, but it served notice on the Japanese that they were not going to surprise the Americans as they had expected to.
First blood had been drawn by the Americans, but the Japanese were undeterred. The Battle of Midway would be decided by the carriers. The Japanese sent an early morning raid against the defenders of Midway. The battle was on.
They were bombing all around the runways and trying to get the big guns, which were very discernible from the air. And they knew they were there. And the ammo dumps and fuel dumps and the mess hall.
I didn't get to see the airplanes from the strike force, but the place was pretty well on fire when we came back. They had hit the fuel dump.
The American planes that survived the initial attack formed up and struck back at the Japanese fleet.
We had 19 airplanes that went out on that because the rest wouldn't didn't make it. And so we flew just as if we were a regular division. We took off and started climbing on a heading of 320, and all of a sudden, after about an hour, we got jumped by 4 or 5 zeros and got added to, and Danny's gunner was killed, and my gunner kept firing, even with his only had 90 rounds per can. He was credited with 1.5 plane, and we stayed in formation. Golf balls were going around us, and we never did make it to the carriers because we'd have never made it to the carriers because the further we went, the more zeros there were. So we went and dove on battleships. I bombed and just missed starboard side of this battleship. I don't think anybody really got a good hit.
Japanese reconnaissance flights had failed to turn up American surface units, and with a report indicating Midway needed a second pounding, Admiral Chuichi Nagumo ordered fragmentation bombs substituted for armor piercing. At this very moment, the first American carrier planes were sent against the Japanese. Radio reports placed the enemy just within the range of Enterprise and Hornet, and the decision was made to launch. Aboard the Japanese carriers, the rearming process was almost complete when reconnaissance flights spotted American ships to the northeast. Minutes later, the presence of an enemy carrier was confirmed.
Consequently, Admiral Nagumo and his air staff had to decide whether they wanted to proceed with the attack on Midway or if they would prefer to incur the unavoidable delay in downloading bombs and uploading torpedoes for an attack on the American carriers now instead of a follow-up attack on Midway.
Nagumo shrewdly changed course to open the range while rearming and refueling took place. It was only by luck that the first American planes arrived over the crowded decks of the Japanese carriers.
Fortuitously for the Americans, Commander Wade McCluskey, leading the Enterprise Air Group, conducted a box search. When he got to that expected contact point in the Pacific, where he reasonably could have expected to find the Japanese, there was just empty water, nothing there. But McCluskey used impeccable logic in solving the problem. He allowed the Japanese a maximum rate of advance along their previous known track, which was to the northwest of Midway, and he made a right turn and followed that leg for about 15 minutes, found nothing, made another turn, and hit gold. He found a Japanese destroyer hastening to rejoin Kido Butai, and McCluskey simply applied logic. He assumed that that Japanese ship was returning to its force. He took that same heading based off the course of the Japanese destroyer, and shortly thereafter was looking at the wakes of 4 Japanese carriers.
Shortly before Commander McCluskey and the dive bombers arrive over the Japanese fleet, the torpedo plane squadrons have found the Japanese fleet acting independently, and they make largely unsupported piecemeal attacks against the Japanese carriers before the dive bombers even arrive on the scene.
The first to find them was Torpedo Squadron 8 from Hornet, which had become separated from its covering force en route. Without waiting for support, Torpedo 8 attacked. Their courage and determination availed them nothing. Of the squadron's 15 planes, all were destroyed and not one hit was scored. Torpedo bombers from Enterprise and Yorktown suffered a similar fate. Of 41 torpedo planes from 3 carriers, only 6 survived.
The great problem with the TBD was not only that it was underarmed and underpowered and was basically a poor attack platform, but also its closure rate on the Japanese fleet was really, really slow.
They were the largest single-engine, stick-controlled airplane in the world.
and they were grossly underpowered. Fellows that lost their lives in those things in the Battle of Midway, I really have to shake my head. And I know just exactly what they were up against, because I've made torpedo bomber runs, and here you are in an underpowered, slow, big target, 10 or 15 feet above the water probably, coming at a ship that everybody's shooting at you. They didn't have a chance.
The loss of the 41 Devastators and most of their crews meant that 3 squadrons of SBDs, 2 from Enterprise and 1 from Yorktown, made their approach at about 15,000 feet undetected until it was far too late for the Japanese fighters to climb as high as they needed to in order to intercept them. And that was the precise moment in time at which it all came together, and the hits that approximately 12 of those SBD pilots got out of the 3 squadrons was enough to destroy Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, and suddenly, in a matter literally of minutes, the odds had gone from 4 Japanese carriers against 3 American to 1 Japanese carrier against 3 American. And the course of the Pacific War had turned just like that.
Western accounts of the Battle of Midway consistently make one major mistake when they're describing the final death throes of the first 3 Japanese carriers to be hit. And that was that their decks were full of fueled and bombed aircraft. Well, if you look very carefully at the Japanese accounts of the battle and of the surviving dive bomber pilots, there were 0 fighters on the decks, but the air groups, the carrier attack planes, the Kates and the Vals, were actually in the hangar decks. And that made the situation worse for the carriers because, unlike their American counterparts, they did not have any way to vent the hangar decks. So when the bombs from the SBDs pierced the flight decks, they hit the hangar deck and created these gigantic conflagrations that no amount of firefighting was going to be able to contain.
The U.S. attack had devastated the main strike force, yet 1 Japanese carrier remained, untouched and deadly.
The Japanese were quick off the mark and launched a dive bombing attack, which arrived overhead Yorktown approximately noon, shootout at high noon in the traditions of the Old West. The long and the short of it was that about 7 Vals got through the CAP, and of those, 3 got hits on the Yorktown. The survivors of that mission returned to Hiryu, reported that they had hit, if not actually sunk, an American carrier, and by that time, Hiryu's Air Department had a second strike ready to go, which in this case was composed largely of torpedo planes escorted by Zeros. They also were intercepted by Yorktown. Again, the Japanese suffered fairly heavy losses, but they did manage to torpedo Yorktown, and this time the damage was significant in that it forced a list in the ship, heavily to port, I believe. And knowing that night was coming on and that the Japanese had overwhelming superiority in surface forces, Captain Buckmaster reluctantly ordered abandon ship. The Yorktown scout bombers had come back from the first mission, and they landed aboard Enterprise and were immediately absorbed into the Enterprise operations plan with good intelligence as to the location of the remnants of the Japanese carriers. Enterprise, followed by Hornet, launched on that location. That American strike went out completely minus fighter escort. They lost a couple of SBDs to the Japanese fighters, but destroyed Hiryu in the process, and recovered just before dark. And at that point, without really knowing it, the battle was decided.
The following day, surviving American aircraft were sent out to finish off some damaged Japanese heavy cruisers struggling to escape.
We were told that there were 2 burning battleships out there, and we were to go out and bomb them. One of them actually sank, and the other one was staggering along, and they went after that. They got 2 or 3 hits on it, and it was polished off by a submarine.
The final episode in the battle occurred the following day when the Yorktown was reboarded with a hand-picked crew of damage control specialists when Japanese submarine launched a spread of 4 torpedoes, and that was all for Yorkie. She was beyond retrieval at that stage. Her crew had to watch her capsize and sink shortly after dawn on the morning of June 7th. And by that time, the battle really and truly was over. And I personally regard it as in Churchillian terms, the end of the beginning.
The balance of power in the Pacific War was forever changed. Admiral Yamamoto's prediction of running wild for 6 months came true almost to the day. The tide of conquest had turned, and the Empire of Japan was forced onto the defensive for the first time in World War II.
There was a gigantic void in Japan's naval offensive capability, and never again were they going to be able to undertake serious strategic operations against the U.S. in an offensive capacity.
One of the ironies of the Battle of Midway is that Japan and the United States lost an identical number of carrier-based pilots and aircrew.
The Americans left on Midway searched for survivors across the expanse of the Pacific that had been a vast battlefield. The air-sea rescue effort saved the lives of many downed American pilots.
We stayed around a few days making open sea landings, picking up survivors. We picked up, I don't know, we probably picked up 14, 15 people altogether out of the water.
The search went on until Hope and the search crews were exhausted. Then there was nothing left for the proud defenders of Midway to do but bury their dead. While the melancholy task of burying the dead went on in the waters off Midway, far to the north, around the Aleutian Islands, other Americans were still locked in combat with the Japanese.
Think anything could be done with this country?
I sure do.
What do you think could be done with it?
I think it could be made a stock country instead.
How?
Well, you'd have to build sheds, cattle, maybe sheep.
I think so, huh? It's wonderful if we, after the war, we could use this for some purpose,
Sure.
wouldn't it? Think maybe you'll stick up here after the war and do it?
Well, why not? Well, hell, I'm single. Geez, I ain't got a worry in the world.
You haven't, huh?
Not a worry.
I see. Was that why you're fighting the war?
That's right. I'm volunteer.
Yeah, huh? That's it. You really believe in the...
Take anything they can dish out.
As the Japanese attack on Midway developed in the Central Pacific, far to the north, a Japanese diversionary force moved to attack American installations in the Aleutian Island chain. As they had planned the complex Midway operation, the Japanese naval staff also considered how best to guard the home islands against a repeat of the Doolittle raid. The Doolittle raid had approached Japan through the storm-tossed northern Pacific. The capture of islands in the Aleutians would provide the Japanese seaplane bases from which to patrol the area. At the same time, such an attack was sure to draw off part of the American fleet and increase the chances of Japanese success at Midway. The Japanese did not know that the United States cryptologists had broken their codes and knew their plans. Short on almost every kind of military resource, the American commanders made the decision to mass what forces they had for an ambush near Midway. The rough waters of the northern Pacific would be left only lightly defended.
When we first went there, we didn't have a dock. We moved on up to some little island out there, Pribilof Islands. There's where the seals would migrate, and we'd watch that too. You know, make a turn around there and make sure that there wasn't any Japanese around there, you know.
The Japanese were there. On the 3rd and 4th of June 1942, the two small carriers of the Diversionary Force launched their aircraft against the American base at Dutch Harbor. Warned by radar, the Americans were ready.
The Aleutian Tigers were based at Fort Glenn, which was a secret airfield that the Japanese didn't know anything about. They flew P-40s, and actually their commanding officer was Claire Chennault's son. And during the initial attack on Dutch Harbor, the 11th was not able to get into action. But later on, while the carrier force was still off Dutch Harbor, some Japanese float planes wandered over the base, not realizing there was a fighter airfield down there, and circled around until the P-40s came up and shot them down.
We weren't in there, but we were up patrolling, and we came in right after they had hit the Dutch Harbor. They hit a few buildings, you know, and stuff, but they didn't, to me, they didn't do that much damage.
One of the escorting fighter planes with the Japanese airstrike that went into the Aleutians lost power during its flight and had to make a crash landing on one of the Aleutian islands. And this plane was subsequently discovered by an American aircraft that was just flying through the area. The Americans then made a very careful effort to salvage that Japanese aircraft in perfect condition. The Americans actually were able to conduct their own flight tests with the Japanese Zero. And doing that, they were able to find the Zero's weak points as a fighter plane and do two things. Not only evolve aerial tactics that maximize their potential against the weaknesses of the Japanese plane, but also use the knowledge of the Japanese aircraft's characteristics to improve the designs of our own fighter planes.
Ultimately, the loss of that 1-0 to anti-aircraft fire would more than compensate the United States for the damage inflicted by the Japanese at Dutch Harbor. The continued presence of Japanese float planes, combined with the sudden loss of communications with the weather stations at the far end of the Aleutian chain, alerted the American commanders that the Japanese had landed somewhere on the islands. This was confirmed on the 10th of June, when a patrol plane spotted Japanese ships in Kiska Harbor. Another PBY reported landing forces on Attu. It was clear that the Japanese had come to stay in the Aleutians. The American commanders in the Pacific now scrambled to counter this new Japanese move.
We got the word then they forming a task force to take the Aleutians back.
They took the first 18 names off the list and they went north. Nobody wanted to go north either.
But in any case, the ships did go into Dutch Harbor, and there was nothing. They were going to be put ashore, and they were going to have to build their whole environment.
While U.S. forces were being assembled, Kiska Island was bombarded by the surface ships the U.S. Navy could spare from the Central Pacific. Aerial reconnaissance showed that the effects of this shelling were uncertain. The dangers inherent in such operations and the ineffective results led the U.S. command to reconsider the best way to attack the Japanese. It was decided to subject the Japanese to sustained aerial bombardment until forces could be readied for a direct assault. To provide an airbase from which to attack the Japanese-held islands, U.S. forces occupied Adak Island in August of 1942. Almost as soon as the troops were ashore, American engineers began work on an airstrip.
The airfield at Adak was actually built on a swamp that engineers had drained, and then they used the sandy bottom as the basis for the strip and laid pierced steel planking down for the runway. Well, that had its uses. I mean, they were able to get this field going in just a couple of weeks, and by September of 1942, they were flying missions. The 11th Air Force was flying missions out of Adak to Kiska. The downside to this particular site was the fact that it was on a swamp. So whenever it rained or there was a willowa that blew through the area, the place filled with water. So there's these remarkable scenes, photographs and film showing planes taking off or landing at Adak, just throwing up huge plumes of water that came over the wings and fuselages. It was a very difficult place to operate out of.
As U.S. forces were to discover, the weather in the northern Pacific was a constant enemy.
The fog was so heavy, at times you couldn't see 50 yards. And other times the wind was so bad that it would roll a railroad tie, would roll it along the ground.
You leave the ground with a 30-minute flight, and 5 minutes after you're off of the ground, you can't see it. And the winds are blowing so hard you couldn't land in it if you could. And they're not uncommon. They're just a powerful wind, full of snow and sleet, that you don't see coming. They're just all of a sudden you're in one. And it's one of those things that you didn't enjoy trying to get back to the base in. But, you get used to landing and not seeing the ground out there. It's just part of flying out there.
Oh man, that's rough country. I've seen that Bering Strait so smooth, you just like glass as far as you can see. And I've seen it just, I swear you'd scrape the bottom between the waves. Man. Oh, what waves that thing can get. It's really rough. We had a crow's nest, and you had to climb up to get in that thing. I spent my time up there. Boy, you go up through a trap door in the bottom, and you had a seat set on 2 handlebars to hang on to. And you had foul weather gear on and had a full mask on, you know. And man, you just look down and you'd see water, and you look down and you'd see water, and you wonder where that ship was, because that thing was just going like that all the time, you know. And if it wasn't going like that, it was going like that, you know.
But if the Japanese were to be isolated from reinforcement, the rough waters around the islands would have to be patrolled by the U.S. Navy. The expectation of a surface battle gradually gave way to the dull routine of patrolling.
We were sent up there with the purpose of keeping the Japs from reinforcing their bases there at Kissgana too. They always had in mind that the Japs was going to, sometime or other, they was going to have this big naval battle.
The boredom of the patrols was only occasionally interrupted by sharp, brief engagements between the patrolling ships and enemy vessels or submarines.
We came under Japanese sub-attack. Our ship didn't have any sonar. It hadn't been equipped with sonar, so it couldn't detect anything. The other ship had the sonar, and it was trying to track the submarine, but it broke. The sonar broke. So the Japanese fired their torpedoes, but they all missed. All of them. So they weren't any more skilled than we were. You know, I don't know how many torpedoes they have on them, but anyway, they all missed. Didn't sink the ships, so they didn't sink the destroyers. And so they were probably having their mechanical problems like we were.
Neither side could escape the impact of nature on their operations.
We made a contact. Of course, the radar officer was there, and the sonar officer. And I said, well, his name was Gronfield, Gronny. I said, what do you think? And he said, let's just trace it for a little bit longer. And traced it, he said, that's a submarine. Here's a guy who was trained to be the sonar officer, who was convinced that that was a submarine. And so we called the captain, and he called general quarters. And the captain says, I think it's a whale. And so he says, let's turn and make another run. And of course we lost it. That was it.
We was patrolling up there one night, and somebody picked up a blimp on their radar. And of course, General Quarters sounded, the word was passed to the fleet. And about 2 o'clock in the morning, they started shooting. I figured, oh, I guess the big battle has started. I hope we make it. And nobody was shooting back. So finally, they decided there's something wrong here. And so they kind of calmed down and and they kind of figured, gee, apparently somebody picked up a blimp on their radar, which was something off the clouds or something. They took for granted that it was the Japs, and somebody starts shooting, and then they picked the shells up going through the air, and pretty soon everybody was shooting everything. I must say that the San Francisco never fired a shot. They said, well, we don't have a target. But some of these old battleships, which they had fixed up at that time, they fired several hundred rounds. They called it the Battle of the Clouds.
In March 1943, a group of patrolling American warships known as Task Force Mike encountered a superior force of Japanese naval vessels escorting a group of merchant ships headed for Kiska. At last, a surface engagement would be fought.
The U.S. Navy finally gets its naval surface action in the Aleutians at the Battle of the Komondorskis, when a task force led by the Salt Lake City engage a Japanese force, almost 2 times their number, in this running gun battle, which becomes one of the longest naval surface actions in the history of the United States Navy. In this almost day-long, inconclusive gunfight, the Japanese fleet is turned back, and the Americans feel that they have successfully stopped the Japanese attempt to reinforce the islands, even though the Salt Lake City is heavily damaged.
The desire to engage the Japanese fleet in a decisive action was only a part of American strategy in the North. The United States had been trying to isolate the Japanese in the Aleutians with naval power, while for months, weather permitting, U.S. bombers and fighters had taken off from Adak to pound the Japanese installations in the islands. Here in the North, as they did everywhere, these missions began with briefings. Crews then manned their planes and began the long flight over water to attack the enemy. However, unlike in other areas due to weather conditions in the Aleutians, the heavy bombers came in low. Fighters and bomber gunners tried to suppress Japanese anti-aircraft fire as planes attacked from different directions and at different altitudes. Then came the return flight and perilous landing. Japanese fire cost the lives of many air crewmen. Following months of effort, extensive aerial reconnaissance of the enemy bases indicated that the Japanese garrisons had successfully been isolated. But to regain the American soil held by the Japanese, an amphibious assault would be needed. The Japanese outposts in the Aleutians seemed to be easy targets for an American assault. However, there was no adequate ground force available to do the job. War was still new to America. A Green Division, the 7th Infantry, had been trained for desert warfare in North Africa.
We were made a motorized division, had half tracks, and we went to the Mojave Desert for 3-month training. And it was hot out there, 140 out there in the desert, and no shade.
Then we picked up this job going to Attu Island, and we were taking up amphibious training. Here we were with boats and landing on the beach.
And we had maybe 3 months training in amphibiously, and we got aboard ship and ship-to-shore training in the landing craft and that kind of thing. And then they were ready for us to go to Attu.
And when the 7th Division reached Attu, they encountered unexpected terrain, weather, and an entrenched and determined enemy.
The Japanese were trenched in on Attu, I'm sure just like they were everywhere else. All over those mountains they could navigate without getting their head into sight. So they were dug in there ready for war.
The initial landings at Massacre Bay on the 11th of May, 1943, were unopposed, and the inexperienced GIs moved inland. They encountered waterlogged ground and thick fog, but struggled on.
2 battalions of 17th Infantry landed on the longest beach, Massacre Bay. They landed there, and the 2 battalions went up the valley abreast until they got up to the head of the valley, and Japanese were waiting for them up there because they were up in the hills right at the head of the valley, up in the fog, looking down through the fog, but they could see them, but the 17th Infantry couldn't see the Japanese. So they got heavy casualties, including the regimental commander.
But that was a terrible night, cold, man. And we didn't have even our sleeping bags. One of the worst things about the march up the hill, or the movement up the hill, we were equipped with leather-soled shoes in this snow and slick. I bet I fell down 15 times going the short distance that we moved up the hill. And actually, I was very disappointed in our people and not getting us better equipped.
The fog come down on the whole thing up there. The Japanese come with the fog. They kill a couple of our people and wound a couple more, and I turned to the general and asked permission to withdraw the troops. I says, I can't do anything about it. They're getting this bad treatment. I can't fire anything. I can't fire my mortars, my machine guns, and our artillery. And he gave me permission to withdraw the troops, so I brought them down the hill. It was a loss.
Terrain, weather, improper equipment, and a tough enemy combined to cause heavier casualties than expected in the 7th Division's baptism of fire. The losses and tenacious resistance by the Japanese meant that more men would be needed.
So our battalion was called in, and we landed about midnight that first day. So we moved up the beach the next day, and our first assignment was to go up this hill up here at the end of the valley and knock out a machine gun that was up there. Well, the captain took one platoon up there to knock out this machine gun. Of course, he didn't get to first base because turns out there was a reinforced Japanese battalion up there. So it was at least 10 days later before we had gained enough ground, gained a little ridge at the lower edge of this mountain.
We were ordered to attack the next morning, and our line of departure was the top of the ridge. Well, just as we jumped off in the attack, the Japanese let go with their artillery right on our line of departure. I think we had 30 people killed or wounded in that first couple of hours there on the hill, and before I was able to call in for naval gunfire. And soon they had the 16-inch guns really One of the guns that they had been firing at it was, when we got down where it had been, it was 50 yards from where it was, the emplacement was. Those big guns really blow things around.
Firepower could only do so much. Another way had to be found to get at the formidable Japanese positions.
E Company was given the task of going up to capture Point Able, it was called. Primary defense, primary control point of that whole part of the island. So we went up at night, made a night attack. Well, the first platoon made contact, and they just started fighting it out man to man up there, and sent the second platoon up behind him to come in and reinforce him up there on the ridge. And two of them pretty well had the Japanese chased off. So we had a fairly successful operation. We had some casualties, no question about that.
A series of night attacks in late May broke open the enemy positions, and the 7th Division closed in on the Japanese base near the Holtz Bay Chickagoff Harbor area.
By that time, you see, we could see clear down into the last stronghold of the Japanese, and they knew that they were done for.
And during the night, the Japanese made a kamikaze attack, they called it.
Their position now untenable, the Japanese launched a final desperate banzai attack.
That was about the end of the thing for us, and we moved on down and cleared out the rest of the people. And so our soldiers, they killed everything they came up against.
By the 30th of May, Attu was cleared, but the Japanese had proven to be a tough, although not invincible, opponent.
On the way up, they were telling us we'd probably would just take this island in maybe 7 to 10 hours. It took us 21 days before we had finally, the Japanese gave up.
The island of Attu had been taken in what would be one of the costliest fights by the U.S. Army in the Pacific Theater. And the fighting wasn't over. The Japanese position on Kiska Island still remained to be taken.
Just wanted to ask you a few questions. I heard that you were on Attu, is that right?
Right.
Pretty tough?
Well, just a little bit on the rugged side.
I can imagine. How long were you on?
Well, since May 11th. I just flew out the day before yesterday.
Day before yesterday. Now, and joined ATF. I see you're sewing on your patches, your ATF number 9 patches. You anxious to go to Kiska?
Sure am.
You really are. You must like to fight, huh? What do you think? You think this is going to be as tough as that, too? What do you figure?
Well, it's kind of hard to say about that. One thing, you got weather in your favor here, and we didn't have it down there.
Yeah, what was it raining or snowing or what on it?
Snow, cold.
Yeah, we're lucky this time. How long do you think it'll take them to take Kiska? That's what I'm interested in.
So is everybody else.
Certainly. What do you figure? You're a veteran by this time.
I don't know.
Take a guess.
Oh, just offhand, I'd say 6 weeks.
To take the Japanese base on Kiska, the 7th Division was reinforced by the elite 1st Special Service Force, a joint Canadian-American commando unit well trained for warfare in winter conditions. As at Attu, naval and air forces bombarded Kiska in preparation for the landings.
And we just bombarded the beach, just absolutely polluted it. Just sail back and forth and just shoot over there. And the Marines landed. And, you know, it was the same way as it was in that too.
We went by rubber boat to Kiska. We tied them together. This is pitch dark at night. We had to find our landing spot in the dark.
On the way in, the waves were pretty high, 4 feet or more even, and they dumped our rubber boat in water, so we're waterlogged. No matter how hard we paddled, we went out with the tide. They had these PT boats running around that we saw, and one came and picked us up.
They had the PT boats disguised as landing craft to draw the enemy fire.
Just as they had been on Attu, the initial landings on Kiska were unopposed. However, unlike the tough fight encountered before, as the patrols moved inland on Kiska, they met no opposition.
Our only engagement was as we pulled down into the main camp, one of the scouts hit the dirt and opened fire. And I thought, well, here it comes. And we deployed and got up there. Well, the Japs had left a dog behind, and he saw this movement in one of the dugouts. And trigger happy, you know, first time in combat, first time I ever pulled a trigger in combat.
The guns were still sticking out of those enemy foxholes and gun positions out there. And then we went to several of the other islands out there and found no Japs or no weapons and so forth. So that kind of was a pretty good exercise and training.
Anyway, that took care of the Aleutian campaign.
The Japanese had escaped from the American trap. The campaign to retake the Aleutians had truly come to an end with the silent and unseen departure of the Japanese. However, the campaign in the north did not end at Kiska. The next 2 years would see a sustained and costly aerial campaign carried out against northern Japan and the Kuril Islands. The Japanese attack at Pearl Harbor had signaled the beginning of a wave of offensives throughout the Pacific. An unbroken string of victories had followed as Allied possessions fell before the tide of Japanese conquest. Only in the Philippines had a sustained stand been made, and that had ended in defeat and surrender. But at the Battle of the Coral Sea, the Japanese had been fought to a draw by the U.S. Navy. The defeat in the Battle of Midway and subsequent failure of the Aleutian campaign ended major Japanese offensive moves in the Pacific War. However, these actions had not defeated Japan. That would take sustained, large-scale American offensives. But the tide of the Pacific War had turned against Japan, and the counterattacks would soon begin with the Guadalcanal and New Guinea campaigns in the southern Pacific.
In those early months of 1942, the job of holding the enemy depended on keeping open the lifeline between the United States and Australia and New Zealand. For the shipment of desperately needed supplies from the United States was vital to Allied hopes for a future victory in the Pacific. Although the war in Europe drew the great bulk of materiel from the U.S., enough supplies were sent to Pacific bases to keep the Allied war effort functioning. Maintaining the lifeline to the down-under countries kept a considerable number of U.S. ships fully occupied. Fortunately, Australia-bound vessels were only rarely attacked. Each loss was keenly felt.
However, all of our massed effort is none too great to meet the demands of this war. We shall need everything that we have and everything that our allies have to defeat the Nazis and the fascists in the coming battles on the continent of Europe and the Japanese on the continent of Asia and in the islands of the Pacific.
The United States turned its full attention to the job of winning the war on both fronts. It was apparent that productive capacity would prove the deciding factor in the winning of World War II. Luckily, American industry was partially on a war basis at the time of the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. Lend-lease and defense appropriations had greatly accelerated war production before the U.S. was itself actively at war. The Pearl Harbor attack provided the stimulus to American industry to convert thoroughly to a war basis. In a relatively short time, the weapons and vehicles of war were being produced in quantities which would have been considered impossible half a year earlier. American industry was delivering the goods to Australia and Egypt, to China, England, and New Caledonia, to Persia and Alaska. American industry produced weapons and equipment not only for American armies, but for Allied forces all over the globe. Before the U.S. had been at war a year, American industry was producing more materiel than all the Axis nations combined. The U.S. was clearly supreme at the business of turning out the machines of war. Equally important was the job of training the men who were to use that equipment. Preparation for battle in modern warfare meant strenuous training for the men who were to fight it. Especially in the Pacific theater, the men had to be prepared for battle conditions and tactics that had no precedent in American military history.
The gentle art of killing them. Come on.
The business of becoming a knowledgeable fighting man required great versatility and techniques of attack.
All right, men, get your guns loaded. We're going down this village street. Clean it out. I want you to remember the enemy's at the other end of the street. You want to move fast, keep under cover, and shoot him first.
In those early months of the war, many soldiers were trained in types of warfare which they would never experience. Many units, later sent to the Pacific theater, had no training in jungle warfare. But thousands of soldiers and Marines were trained under actual battle conditions, with live ammunition. All this disagreeable training was to prove its value quickly, when the men found themselves in similar situations in combat against the enemy. In anticipation of a war in the Pacific Basin someday, the U.S. Marine Corps had been experimenting in techniques of amphibious warfare since the early 20s. Landing exercises had been part of the Marine curriculum for 7 years before World War II. With war in the Pacific a reality, the Marine technique of amphibious warfare was about to meet its sternest test. On both coasts of the U.S., new soldiers and Marines learned how to make a landing. And even more important, how not to make a landing. It took a while for the rough edges to be knocked off the boots, but the intensified training program turned out troops ready for action. In command of the men who were destined to seize the offensive in the first Pacific invasion were generals with a thorough groundwork in amphibious warfare. Men like General Alexander Vandergrift, soon to be commander of the 1st Marine Division. Marine training also stressed close air support of ground forces in all large-scale tactical exercises. Vehicles designed especially for use in amphibious operations were beginning to come off the production line. Though no one knew for certain in early 1942 just how the Japanese planned to defend their island fortresses, America's invading forces were well prepared for almost any eventuality. The time was approaching when freshly trained U.S. troops would help defend the free world against the aggressors.
The day will come. It will come when British and American armies march into countries not as invaders, but as liberators. And when from the soil there spring up in passionate hope and valiant effort the peoples who have been held down under a cruelest of barbarian yoke.
The U.S. Navy had embarked on a new program of building up its strength before the attack at Pearl Harbor plunged the U.S. into war in the Pacific. For Navy leaders realized that if the U.S. were to become involved in World War II, her Navy must be prepared to wage effective warfare with vessels which could outmatch anything an enemy could put afloat. On that basis, America's new Navy was developed. After Pearl Harbor, the reinforcement of America's badly crippled Pacific Fleet was of top priority urgency. While the U.S. Navy fought a holding action in the Pacific during the early months of 1942, production was rushed on new ships, among them new carriers, from whose decks American planes would carry the fight to the enemy. Before many months passed, the Navy's score with the Japanese would be pretty well settled.
American P-40s first went into combat on the morning the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor. While marauding Zeros destroyed most of the Air Corps' fighters on the ground, a few P-40s managed to get airborne and strike back at the Japanese. Climbing into their P-40s at an auxiliary field, Lieutenants George Welch and Ken Taylor scored the first air-to-air kills of the war.
They weren't strafing that field. Hay had overlooked it, and we were able to get into the air, George and I, with no problem, and started looking back to Wheeler, looking for the attacking force. Planes were falling all around, flaming, and he'd shoot a burst in there, and the plane didn't have self-sealing tanks, and it would explode immediately. And in other cases, I'd seem to get on one's tail and just be pouring a lot of ammunition into him, and all he was doing was smoking. I was getting some from them on my plane, and right through the old canopy, and that's a good lesson that the war is two-way. It's very quickly. I was beginning to feel like this was too simple, but we generally had a very fine, successful morning as far as we were concerned, but you couldn't consider it very much considering the airplanes that we lost.
Hours later, American P-40s fought a second battle, this time in the skies over the Philippines. This one was a foregone conclusion even before the action was joined, thanks to pre-war decisions made by the Army Air Corps. In the final months before Pearl Harbor, scores of P-40s were shipped to the Philippines to reinforce the defenses there and help protect the vital B-17s that had recently been deployed to Clark Field on Luzon.
The American flyers that went with these P-40s to the Philippines were mostly inexperienced. They'd come straight from advanced training. They didn't have a lot of time in aircraft, period, let alone in fighter aircraft. And most of them had not had an opportunity to fire aerial gunnery at all before December 7th, 1941.
Making the transition from docile trainers like the AT-6 to the tricky P-40 took time and experienced instructors. The units in the Philippines had neither.
The American pilots who flew in the Philippines had been briefed they'd be up against an inferior enemy, flying obsolete aircraft by pilots who were nearsighted and barely capable. They thought they were in for an easy fight. It turned out to be anything but. They paid the price for a failure of operational intelligence.
I had a very low opinion of what I thought their ability would be. And being as young as I was, I had too high of opinion on exactly how good I was. I spent the next 60 years realizing how little I knew.
With no realistic understanding of the Japanese, the P-40 pilots in the Philippines didn't have any idea how to employ their aircraft tactically to its best advantage. When the war broke out and Japan's air forces attacked the Philippines, the American pilots suffered catastrophic losses at the hands of the veteran Japanese.
P-40 got its bad press at the beginning of the war in the Philippines when the guys flying them had just got there out of flying school. You know, they had no flying experience much in anything, much less a P-40.
In order to humiliate the Americans, the Japanese pooled
their most experienced pilots. They thrust their best against the Americans to absolutely wipe them out, which they did.
Within a month, the U.S. Army Air Corps presence on Luzon was almost totally wiped out. The few surviving P-40s escaped to Bataan, where MacArthur used them for reconnaissance and as ground attack weapons.
Our P-40s, we had 7 flying at that time. Our P-40s attacked the barges at sea, and whenever some of the barges did make it in, well, we would get into hand-to-hand combat with them as they tried to make it onto the beach and establish their beachhead.
Even in this disaster, there was still a glimmer of hope and a glimmer of the P-40's potential. Several times, some notable pilots, including Buzz Wagner, one of our first aces, and Ed Dice, another great P-40 pilot, early P-40 pilot, launched surprise attacks on Japanese airfields on Luzon. Dice went to Nichols Field, Buzz Wagner attacked one in northern Luzon, and in these strafing attacks, the ruggedness and the firepower of the P-40 demonstrated that it could survive in this role and cause a lot of damage.
The ground crews struggled to keep them flying despite all manner of obstacles.
We had several P-40s, which we assembled. Each time an airplane was damaged, we'd take the parts from one and put them on another. And we had one that we called a P-40 something, which was a very difficult airplane to fly.
By the spring of 1942, the last of the P-40s on Bataan had been destroyed.
If you look at the early operational use or deployment of the P-40, you see that well over half of their losses are due to inexperienced pilots and poor airfields, and just the bad conditions in the forward area.
In February of 1942, American P-40 pilots fought a desperate last stand over Java. It was a hopeless task.
There in Java, when every plane would come back shot up, the morale hit bottom, and pilots would be saying, well, this is nothing but suicide here. It's going to be me. The next mission is going to get me. It was that bad.
In March of 1942, with Japanese troops assaulting their Javanese air bases, the last P-40 pilots made their escape to Australia.
We get about, 500 feet or so high, and Zeros are strafing B-24 just 300 yards away from us. Of course, we're expecting them to attack us in the air, but they overlooked us somehow, and we escaped the airfield.
The hopeless campaigns in the Philippines and Java stained the P-40's reputation forever. Some considered it dangerous to fly and thought that it could not survive against first-line enemy aircraft. Lost in those defeats were the P-40's better attributes. The P-40N turned out to be the best Army Air Corps medium-altitude fighter of the war. Capable of almost 400 miles per hour on the deck, it could outturn a P-38 and a P-47 below 20,000 feet with ease. If handled right, it could also beat a P-51.
There was a P-51 group in Europe that kept a P-40 in their inventory to teach humility to some guy that thought he was getting pretty hot. They'd have him go up and maneuver against this P-40 with a good P-40 pilot in it.
Deployed almost exclusively to the Pacific by the fall of 1943, the P-40N quickly earned the affection of its pilots.
It was the most agile, quickest, most maneuverable of any of the planes we had in the Pacific, was the P-47s and the P-38s. We liked it because of that factor. It couldn't really compete in maneuverability with the Zero, but it came closer than anything else we had. It was a very dependable airplane.
It also carried more firepower than any other Army Air Corps fighter of its time except the P-47. With 6 50-caliber machine guns, P-40 pilots could pour lead onto any target, usually with devastating results.
The P-40 had 6 50-caliber machine guns, wing-mounted, of course, and all hooked to one trigger. They were zeroed in for the optimum of 250 yards. And the gun sights we used were pretty primitive. We had some still with the old ring and post, had a ring in the cockpit and a post out on the nose of the airplane, and that was your rear and front sights.
The N's terrific medium-altitude performance lent itself to the bomber escort role in the Southwest Pacific area.
The 5th Air Force is undertaking low-level attacks using B-25s and A-20s, and escorting these attacks with P-47s or P-38s is really not very effective because they're much better at higher altitudes. The P-40N, on the other hand, just comes into its own in this kind of escort mission because it operates much more effectively below 20,000 feet.
Some of the guys that I've talked to were surprised that we were still flying P-40s in August of 1944 down in the war. But the way the 5th Air Force operated, I think a P-40 was an ideal airplane because the bombers there were all strafers. They went in right on the deck, and we would be about 7,000 feet above them. And at that altitude, in my opinion, a P-40 is a better fighter than either P-47 or P-38.
We were flying along escorting bombers, and we were just weaving back and forth over the bombers, covering both sides and the rear and the front. And we weren't the only squadron doing this, and the P-38s were then flying a higher cover. All of a sudden, in front of me, I see this red ball going by on a fighter plane, a Tony, I believe it was, and just automatically my belly tank dropped and my gun switches all came on, and I'm in a 90-degree bank going after him when this number 13 P-40 from the 7th Squadron came right in front, right on the tail of this Tony. That was DeHaven, and he got it.
Did he?
Oh, yeah.
Debonair Bob DeHaven, who went on to star in several Hollywood films and later serve as Howard Hughes' personal pilot, was but one of dozens of aces who flew the P-40 in the Pacific. In the hands of such men, the P-40N proved to be a capable air superiority fighter. In combat against it, the Japanese suffered heavy losses.
We dropped our tanks and went in on our first pass, but the bombers had made a turn that made me the closest to them. So I made a pass on the bombers and misjudged, and I was almost to ram this one by the time I bent my guns into fire on him, and I had time for just a short burst and had to pull up and go over him. As I went over him, I could see through this canopy the glow building down inside the aircraft. Bill Elliott said that very soon after I went over it, when it blew up, just pieces all over the sky.
By June of 1944, the P-40's combat service was coming to an end. As the fighting in New Guinea wound down, more and more P-38s became available, and many of the Warhawk squadrons converted to the sleeker, faster Lightnings. In some cases, the P-40Ns that remained were growing war-weary with tired engines and patched-up airframes.
And they gave me an airplane that had been rebuilt down at Depot that was something radically wrong with that thing. So it didn't fly worth a darn. And it almost killed a couple other guys before it almost killed me.
Nevertheless, P-40 squadrons soldiered on, performing more and more ground attack and fighter-bomber missions through 1944 as Japanese aerial opposition in New Guinea dried up.
We had some dive bombing missions. One I remember in particularly was in support of some Australian troops, and the criticism was that our bomb pattern was too small. We were all dropping on each other's bombs. P-40 was a good dive bomber. He just stood up on that left rudder to counteract the torque.
Warhawks remained in frontline service through much of 1944 and even into 1945 as tactical reconnaissance aircraft for the AAF. Other nations used their P-40s in many cases right up until the end of the war, including Australia, the Soviet Union, New Zealand, and China.
When the production of the P-40 came to a conclusion in November of 1944, the company had actually made something like 13,000 P-40s, but there was nothing else to replace it. And this marked a turning point in the history of the Army Air Force, actually. This was a relationship that stretched back 20 years to the P-1 Hawk, and now that relationship had effectively been severed. Curtiss Airplane Company's days were limited, and the Air Force moved forward with better designs from newer and different companies.
Misunderstood for decades, its reputation scarred by the defeats suffered in the Philippines and Java, the P-40 has been consigned to mediocrity by legions of post-war aviation writers and historians. Yet the truth is, the P-40, when employed correctly, could be a capable and deadly aircraft. For 2 critical years, it formed the backbone of the U.S. Army Air Corps' fighter units and held the line until better aircraft with longer combat range could be produced. Obscured by flashier fighters like the P-51 and P-38, the Warhawk has been denied its proper place in World War II history. For those who flew it, though, its legacy is enduring.
I would say the P-40 was just a very easy airplane to fly and a very good one. It had good speed, and obviously it couldn't turn with the zero, but didn't need to.
The P-40 was an airplane, very forgiving airplane. You could make a lot of mistakes, and it was so quick that you could recover from most of the mistakes that we as pilots made.
Arriving in Hawaii some 2 weeks after the attack at Pearl Harbor, Admiral Chester W. Nimitz assumed command of the Pacific Fleet. For the next 3.5 years, he faced the overwhelming job of fighting the Japanese in an all-out war under handicaps of staggering proportions.
We were faced with a gigantic job. The Pacific Ocean encompasses almost 70 million square miles. To wage war across this trackless battleground was an enormous task for any fleet or combination of fleets. With our crippled Pacific Fleet, the job in early 1942 was all but impossible. But with every available ship and every officer and man in the Pacific Fleet dedicating himself to the task, we were determined to carry the war to the heart of the enemy's homeland. The enemy had scored a devastating blow at Pearl Harbor, but it was a blow from which we would recover, from which we must recover. The U.S. Navy in the Pacific turned to and set about countering that blow.
Japan's strikes on December 8th turned World War II into a truly global conflict.
They have certainly embarked upon a very considerable undertaking. After the outrages they have committed upon us at Pearl Harbor, in the Pacific Islands, in the Philippines, in Malaya and the Dutch East Indies, they must now know that the stakes for which they have decided to play are mortal. Many people have been astonished that Japan should in a single day have plunged into war against the United States and the British Empire. What kind of a people do they think we are? Is it possible they do not realize that we shall never do the person until they have been forced, which now...
The first move in the Navy's plan of attack called for the establishment of bases in the far reaches of the Pacific. Bases from which the Navy's warships and amphibious forces could attack the enemy in his own bailiwick. During the early months of the war, the establishment of those advanced bases on islands with unfamiliar names was a matter of great urgency. Inasmuch as the islands were not many miles from enemy territory, planes were the most important items of equipment. The bases hurriedly rushed into operation in the South Pacific in those early months of the war were in great measure responsible for staving off the enemy in his drive toward Australia and New Zealand. Without those bases, the U.S. would have been at such a disadvantage that it is quite doubtful that the enemy could have been checked in the far Pacific. But though planes did arrive at the new Pacific bases, they were few in number. Because of shortage of shipping in the Pacific, and because of the buildup of an offensive in the European theater, the air bases in the Pacific were scantily stocked with planes. When a small shipment of new planes did arrive, they were quickly assembled and ready for their first takeoff. The Army and its Air Force were convinced of the importance of these island air bases, which were often referred to as unsinkable carriers. Army and Marine engineers and Navy Seabees worked under constant pressure on the construction necessary to put the new U.S. South Pacific bases in operating condition. Everyone was well aware that he was involved in a race against time, for the enemy was in a good position to move a little farther south and overwhelm the U.S. island bases. The engineer units accomplished almost impossible feats of construction. Occasionally, in their haste, they suffered a setback in their progress. As the Japanese swept southward and seized control of the Pacific Islands in their path, they quickly built bases from which they could press the attack even further. Japanese military strength on its newly captured islands in the early months of the war was considerable. And the first concern of the Japanese militarists in taking over a new island was the preparation of the facilities necessary for the operation of an air base. But once the basic military requirements were satisfied, the Japanese relaxed, confident that they could hold their newly won territory without trouble. In those early months of 1942, the aggressors had a fairly easy time of it. There was even time for baseball, a game they still loved, even though it was the national sport of the hated American enemy. The Japanese Navy was proud of its submarine service, but somehow its subs had not been used to any extent as raiders of U.S. shipping. Though the subs were well constructed, the Japanese simply didn't know how to use them to maximum advantage as an offensive weapon. The Japanese militarists had paid relatively little attention to the importance of supply in the maintenance of its far-flung conquests. As they gradually awoke to their shortcomings on the planning level, the Japanese Army Command subsequently brought pressure to bear on the Navy to provide combat submarines for transportation of Army supplies. But the main elements of the Japanese Navy were used to full advantage. Japanese sailors were proficient in the performance of their assigned duties and possessed a strong fighting spirit. Not for over a century had the U.S. faced an enemy Navy so tough and well-trained as the Japanese. In February 1942, that Navy was at peak strength, ready and anxious to engage any Allied naval units which could be located. In late February, 2 Japanese naval forces proceeded southward in a pincer movement against Java. On February 27th, in the Java Sea, the Japanese fleets gained their opportunity. On that afternoon, the Japanese movement south was challenged by a ragtag Allied force of American, Dutch, Australian, and English warships, which had never operated as a unit. The Japanese naval forces went into action at once. The Allied fleet, operating with little coordination, was foredoomed to defeat. While losing no ships of their own, the Japanese virtually annihilated the Allied force, sinking 2 cruisers and 3 destroyers in the 8-hour-long action, and knocking out 7 more Allied warships attempting to escape. From that point on, the Japanese held complete control of those waters. But the picture was not all black for the Allies. In late January, fast U.S. carrier forces were assigned to move into enemy-controlled waters and carry out a raid on the Marshall Islands, a strong link in Japan's outer defense ring. Early on the morning of February 1st, the fleet was in position for the attack. Its planes and ships opened up against 6 atolls in the eastern and central Marshalls. In command of Task Force 8, in that first daring raid into enemy territory, Admiral Bull Halsey was overjoyed that he had been given this chance to hit back at the enemy. Striking force damaged a number of enemy installations on several islands. But perhaps even more important was the lift the raid gave to American morale on the fighting fronts and in the U.S. A few weeks later, Wake was hit in the first attack on that island, which the Japanese had had such difficulty in seizing some 2 months earlier. Early in March, Japanese positions in New Guinea came under attack by a fast U.S. carrier fleet, which effectively plastered the enemy at Lae and Salamaua. The Japanese failed to realize that their plans for future attacks against U.S. forces in the Pacific were no longer a Japanese secret. Shortly before the Battle of Coral Sea, the U.S. Navy had succeeded in breaking the Japanese code. This fortunate turn of events came at a point when the U.S. Pacific Fleet was in feeble condition to fight a war across the stretches of that vast ocean. As in the case of the Coral Sea, the U.S. Navy had advance information on the next Japanese strike. A planned attack on Midway Island, westernmost outpost of the Hawaiian archipelago.